Your notes in your bulletin has a front and a back, but we're only going to get to the front this morning, all right? So leave the back for next week. Because things happen in the world, right? Many of us, we have never experienced something like the assassination attempt of a leader. And why is it so significant when a leader might be removed in this way? Certainly, it is a cowardly way to end a movement or try to defeat an ideology. There's a law of nature. Cut off the head, and the rest will die. But as Christians, our leader is Jesus Christ. He has done what no one else could ever do because he is someone that no one else could ever be. This is what we're told in Colossians chapter 1, verse 13 through 15. If you're following along with our reading plan, you would have come across this yesterday. We were reading Colossians 1, verse 13 through 15. Speaking of Jesus, he has, and speaking of what he has done that no one else would ever be able to do, he has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. God has done this. And then he goes on to explain this beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. That is our leader. Assassination is the attempt to silence the voice of a leader in order to stop the movement that they command. And as Christians, we can completely trust that God's movement of his Holy Spirit will never be stopped. And this is because the head of the church can never be cut off. Jesus can never be silenced. But sadly, God can be disobeyed. And we see a way that God's people have been disobeying him for centuries in their approach to marriage and divorce. We know that our culture has certainly gone in much of the same direction in treating marriage like some sort of temporary contract. But we will hear from Jesus this morning and he will set the record straight. And as his followers, it is our responsibility to hear him and obey. This morning, I want to let Jesus speak as we are setting the record straight on divorce. And I just want to say I'm very glad that we have the opportunity to just dip our toes into these verses here this morning, as I think you will see in the first 6 verses of Matthew 19 that there is enough for one message, for sure. But I'm also glad because I want to take the opportunity to comfort and encourage and challenge you in a way that speaks the truth in love as we continue through the rest of the verses. Because certainly what we don't want to do is what Jesus does not do here, and that is to condemn people because of having divorce and remarriage in their past. That is not what Jesus is doing here. But he is setting the record straight. And you'll see that the people of his day needed the record to be set straight regarding marriage and divorce. So we pick up chapter 19 of Matthew, starting in verse 1. Where we read, "Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan." So we're talking east of the Jordan River. "And large crowds follow him, and he healed them." Matthew's narrative of Jesus' ministry here takes a turn toward Jerusalem. And the drama becomes more intense with the anticipation of a showdown at the Passover in Jerusalem. You may already know that that Passover is going to be the last Passover of Jesus' time on earth. It is going to be the Passion Week. It is going to lead up to his crucifixion and his resurrection. And Jesus' following will only grow along the way as he makes his trip down to Jerusalem with all the other pilgrims coming down from Galilee headed toward the Passover. And as he goes during these chapters, we will see he's teaching, he's healing, he's answering challenges from religious leaders along the way. He's creating a big hubbub. And so we see in verse 3, Pharisees come up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" Attempting to draw Jesus into one of their petty debates among their teachers, some Pharisees asked Jesus about this sticky issue. What justification is needed for a man to send his wife away? I mean, literally, that is what's being asked here. Because that is the condition among the Jews at this time. What is required if a man wants to just send his wife away? And that's what has been going on for centuries among the Jewish people in this point in history. So we read in verse 4, he answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" That's where Jesus goes. You can imagine why in this day and age, we're going to sit on that statement a little bit today. Okay, so he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, so the one who created them said, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." And this leads then into the verses that we will look at next week as well. Verse 7, they said to him, "Why then did Moses command a person, meaning, to give a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." The disciples said to him, so the disciples have this opportunity, and they really reveal, like, even good, righteous people that are trying to honor the Lord, they reveal their culture. If such is the case of a man and his wife, it is better not to marry. Not exactly what we were expecting to hear from these guys. But he said to them, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven." And he closes up with saying, basically, it's only those who are able to receive this. Let them receive it. You know, the Jewish people of Jesus' day had gone along with a lot of traditions that people had decided were true. But in reality, the tradition was misunderstood, and it was harming many people in their society. This tradition that dated all the way back to Deuteronomy, centuries before Jesus showed up, on the issue of divorce. Specifically, not how does a wife divorce her husband. It was, what does a husband need in order to send his wife away? Complete misunderstanding of what God had allowed for in the law, and they had turned it into thinking that this is what God commands. And we'll get into that next week, as I mentioned. One of these that we're looking at is the issue of divorce, and we're going to see that in order to understand it, we have to go back to God's creation of mankind. That's what Jesus does. The foundation is what he goes back to. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? How did this become controversial? But it has. So from Jesus' answer to the truths that he revisits here, I hope to convince you to stick to God's design for marriage. Stick to God's design for marriage. And hopefully, if you're in the situation to be able to influence the next generation, I hope to equip you to be able to do so. If you're in the situation in which maybe you need to look back on your history and confess something to God and to be able to walk in freedom, I hope to equip you to be able to do that. But certainly what I don't want to do, and this what Jesus does not do here, is to bring some sort of condemnation on you because maybe divorce and remarriage is in your past. That is not what Jesus intends here. If you are in Christ, as we are told, there is therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. But Jesus certainly does offer an explanation and understanding of why this is so vital and important and crucial for our culture. So we see Jesus' answer in verse 4, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Rather than being dragged into this modern debate, Jesus goes to the foundation of who we are, who we were intended to be. He appeals to the very creation of man and woman, and he refers to the fact that God created us as such, male and female. And you know, we need each other in order to actually bear God's image. Because that's what we're told in Genesis. He created them in the image of God, male and female he created them. Only the Creator has the authority to define his creation and the purpose that he gave to it. Jesus also appeals to the Old Testament scriptures as the Word of God. If you notice, he says, when he said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother. Jesus it's just important to notice that he gives acknowledgement this is the inspired Word of God. In sticking to God's design for marriage, the first foundational issue that Jesus points to is that marriage is between one man and one woman. This is where Jesus goes when he's asked about divorce. Why is that? With most questions, it's best to remember the foundational truths before we come up with answers. You know, I've referenced this fable a lot in the last few years. But a fable was told of a king who had these hucksters, these liars, these manipulators come into his kingdom. They were thieves. They claimed that they could make the most beautiful clothes in all of the world. And so they said, but there's just one. So they said, for X amount of money, more money than the king had ever paid for any of his wardrobe, they could weave for him the most beautiful clothing, the most beautiful fabric, and they were going to create the most beautiful clothes that anyone had ever seen. And they said, but the only thing is, you can't see it until it's done. And so they get to work, and it's very so they get to work on this clothing. They're part way done, and the king asks one of his advisors, I'm not supposed to see the clothing, but will you go and look at it and tell me how the progress is going and let me know what it looks like? And so the advisor's like, sure, I can go and do that. And so he goes in and he says, and the weavers, the clothing makers supposedly, tells the advisor, okay, well, here's the deal. The clothing can only be seen by the most wise of people. Only the smartest people can actually see the fabric that we are weaving. In reality, they weren't weaving anything. There was nothing there. But this advisor's like, oh no. What if I can't see it? What if I might be shown that I'm not truly wise? And so he's got this anxiety there, and he walks in, and just as he was worried, he can't see it. Well, he can't see it because there's nothing there. But they had worked this pressure on this king's advisor to the point where he was like, I'm going to have to act like I can see this, because Lord knows I can't let anybody know that I'm not wise enough to see this fabric. And so they're like, oh, and we need the down payment. I mean, isn't it beautiful? Can't you see how valuable it is? He's like, oh, yeah. How amazing. This is the most beautiful fabric I've ever seen in my life, because he wants everybody to think that he's wise. He wants everybody to think that he knows what's going on. There's nothing there. And so he pulls out the money. He's like, here's the bag of money. Here's the down payment. Keep up the good work. And he goes back to the king, and the king's like, how does it look? And he's like, well, there's this thing, king. Only the wisest of people can actually see the fabric. The king's like, what? He's like, yeah, but I'm going to tell you this. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It's gorgeous. It's the most beautiful fabric I have ever seen. Your clothing is going to be gorgeous. The king's like, well, I'm encouraged by that, but I'm also encouraged. I must have the wisest advisor in all of the land. So time goes on, and the king sends the clothing is taking a amount of time, and the king's kind of getting nervous. He sends one advisor after another, and they come back explaining the same experience. Well, king, I was told only the wisest advisor could ever see this, and here I was able to see it, which must mean that I'm wise. And it's gorgeous. And so it finally gets to the point where the king is ready to see his clothing, and these hucksters, these charlatans, pull out a hanger, and it's empty. And the king's anxious all of a sudden. Oh no, I don't see anything. But he's like, but I gotta act like I can. I gotta act like I'm wise. I got to get on board with what's actually, with the culture here. I got to act like I know what they're talking about. So the king looks at it and says, it's gorgeous. I've never seen clothing so beautiful. The king actually puts it on, and they actually have a parade through the town where he's naked as a jaybird, but acting like he's got the most beautiful clothing he's ever seen before. And the townspeople were all told ahead of time, just to let you know, only the wisest, the smartest people in the land can actually see this clothing. And so all the adults are sitting there going, oh, it's gorgeous. Oh, it's amazing. That's the most beautiful clothing I've ever seen. There's nothing there. Until finally, one child looks and says, is it me, or is the king naked? And slowly the snickers start happening among the crowd. And slowly the crowd, all these commoners, all these backward people are starting to recognize, I have backward people in quotes here, are starting to recognize, I'm not the only one. This is nuts. And as Hans Christian Andersen writes this fable, he closes that the king starts to realize, I really don't know if I'm wearing anything or not, but I've just got to keep this charade up. And his advisors actually trail off following him, holding the train that doesn't exist, because they're sitting there thinking, I got to keep up this charade because I really don't know this clothing exists or not, but I've bought into this, and so I got to keep going. This story shows how it can happen, that a whole group of people can be caused to think incorrectly, or can be caused to think with groupthink, well, I have to check my brain at the door, but if that's what everybody else is doing, that's what I must be important for me to do. But people can also be pressured not to use their common sense, even with popular ideas that are crazy. And eventually people can be scared of standing out so much that they don't believe what they are even saying. But they just don't want to be on the outside of the crowd, even if the crowd is living a lie. In the fable, the lie is that you can't believe your eyes. And the rationalization of the situation is, well, only the wisest people can actually see it. So if you want people to think you're wise, you better go along with the group. And just don't believe your eyes. 2,000 years ago, God told us of this rebellious world that claiming to be wise, they will become fools. And now we have federal judges that claim that they are unqualified to even say what a woman is because they're afraid of going against the grain. They're afraid of the crowd. I've seen footage of people watching a high school boy easily defeat a high school girl in track meets. And when people in the crowd complain and speak of him as a boy, others stand up and protest, she's a girl, because they have to go along with the crowd. The foolishness. This is the sort of intimidation that calls for everyone to be foolish, lest they be labeled a bigot. In the fable of choose your own gender, the lie is that there's more than just being male and female. The rationalization of the situation is that a person's gender is different than their sex. What Jesus tells us is he who created them from the beginning made them male and female. I'm not sure you can say it any more clear. And according to Jesus, this is a foundational issue on which marriage is based. That's why we go there. In sticking to God's design for marriage, the second foundational issue that Jesus points out is that marriage results in a new family that is accountable to God. Marriage results in a new family that is accountable to God. This is God's design. That's why he says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. They were no longer two, but one flesh. The inference, which is what the therefore is that the offspring of two homes break away from those two homes and make a new home through marriage, united in their covenant and in their physical intimacy. The statements that Jesus makes here are universal and unchanging. God created mankind as two expressions of his image, male and female, and the intention is that they become one in marriage and express that image of God together. God created marriage to bind two into one and make a new union that is accountable to God. Now, through listening to podcasters, great thinkers like one of my favorites is Albert Mohler, I've learned about a principle called subsidiarity. Okay, that's like a $5 word here. Subsidiarity. The Oxford English Dictionary defines subsidiarity as this way. It's the principle that central authority should have a subsidiary function, performing only those tasks which cannot be performed by on the more local level. In other words, The larger authority should only come into play where the smaller authority needs it to. God's design was to put a man and a wife broken away from their original homes, becoming one, and them being accountable to God. And all other authority is dependent on those two obeying God together. That's his design, is for their eyes to primarily be on God. Albert Mohler puts it this way: subsidiary follows the very logic of God's creational order that is revealed in the book of Genesis. It tells us that the most basic unit of human society is the man and the woman coming together in marriage to form a family, and then to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. You see how Jesus builds on, he created them man and woman, and then his intention was for them to split off from their homes and be united in marriage, and for them to be accountable to God for themselves, to be obedient to him. God has designed the family to have its own functional structure in the husband and wife, and those two to be living in obedience to God and in functioning, if they are to function best. And of course, God commands us to live in submission to governing authorities, but this doesn't mean that we allow other authorities to remove our primary responsibility to our family or to define family for us. The first step in accomplishing the goal of a husband and wife accepting their responsibility to God is for them to recognize that they are no longer under the authority of their parents. That's what Jesus is getting at here. This is about sticking to God's design for marriage. And he gets to his conclusion when he basically stating marriage cannot be dissolved then by a decree of man. He says, what therefore God has joined together, in other words, what God therefore has joined together, let not man separate. The result is that the change in a law or interpretation does not change what God made happen. He has joined two together in covenant. So the point being made here is this: stick to God's design for marriage. And we're going to get into how that related to, in the Jewish culture, what was going on with divorce and what's going on with in our world with divorce. And I want to take that time next week so that I can also make sure that this is not heaping guilt or condemnation on any of you, and that it's also giving us a better, clear picture of marriage and divorce more specifically. But thinking in terms of sticking to God's design for marriage, what would you think if, let's say you have an empty lot across the street from your house, okay? And you find out somebody bought that lot. Oh, good. We're going to have neighbors, if you like neighbors. You know, I'm sorry. If you don't like neighbors, I'm sorry. But so somebody bought the house. Somebody bought the lot. And they're like, okay, things are moving. You know, some equipment comes out there, starts moving dirt around, you know, and next thing you know, they're digging down and they're digging out dirt to put the footings down, and next thing you know, the concrete truck is out there. They've framed it up. They've laid the footings for the house, and that's where the house is. If you're like me, you know, when nobody's in the evening, you embarrass your wife and you go over and you're looking at over there and seeing what's going on. Oh, I think that's where this is going to be, and that's where this is going to be. And your wife is saying, "Get off their property," you know. But, you know, you can start to see this is what the layout of the house is going to be like, right? This is where the walls are going to be and all that. And so after a while, that foundation gets firmed up, and they come out, and the foundation workers come out, and they take the wood off of it, and it's all ready for the carpenters. And the next thing is the truck comes out and it drops off the lumber, and there's the trusses, and there's the joists, and there's all the 2x4s and everything. And the carpenter comes out, and you see him start to put things together. And you see him get the joists out and lay them out and all that. And he starts putting the joists together, and you're watching, you're like, something's wrong here. Because the foundation's here, and he's putting the wood together over here. He's not even putting it on the foundation. What is going on? And you're watching, and pretty well, the house is going up right there on the dirt. You're sitting there thinking, at some point there's a point of no return. No crane is going to pick this thing up and put it on the foundation. This person is deciding to build this house, to waste all of this material, putting it together off of the foundation. This is not going to end well. This is a waste. This is why Jesus takes us back in the discussion of divorce and remarriage to the foundation of who we are. Society does not work if marriage does not work. Marriage does not work if it is not understood that this is a covenant that we have made together, that we have become one, that it is going to take the judgment, the ruling of God for us to be separated. And we'll get into what can that look like next week. But that itself is based on the fact that God has made us man and woman, male and female, for the purpose of us bearing his image together before the world. Jesus takes us back to the foundation. We should respond in the same way to how marriage is being redefined today. This is not going to work because they're trying to build it off of the foundation. The questions like marriage and divorce, we must return to the foundation for the answers, the truths as Jesus did. We're reminded of this in what we sang here this morning. Before the day, before the light, before the world revolved around the sun, God on high stepped into time and wrote the story of his love for everyone. He has filled our hearts with wonder so that we always remember you and I were made to worship. You and I were called to love. What were we created for? When the world steps away from that, when the world steps away from what we were made to be, it's not going to work. You and I are forgiven and free. You and I embrace surrender. When you and I choose to believe, then you and I will see what we were meant to be. That's what Jesus returns us back to here. And I encourage you to surrender to it. Surrender to it in your relationships. Surrender to it in your marriage. Surrender to it in the words that you share with your loved ones regarding marriage and family and gender. You see what Jesus did here? He laid the foundation. And you can see that, you can see it in your bulletin, right? He explains to us that we were created by God and for God. All right? And he says this when he says, he who created them from the beginning. And so you can see that if you want to move that forward. So that number one, if you'll notice, is on the bottom, right? We were created by God and for God. And you know, if somebody wants to challenge that, you can just tell them, Jesus said we were created from the beginning. Sorry, argue with Jesus. Then Jesus says that we were created by God as male and female. Okay? If somebody wants to protest that with you, you can tell them, Jesus said he who created them made them male and female. Argue with Jesus. On that, Jesus lays that next foundational understanding that marriage is the result of a new family unit that is accountable to God. where he says, as we mentioned, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And on top of all of that, that's why Jesus says that marriage cannot be dissolved by a decree. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Let me ask you this. Over the last 5, 10, 20 years, how many of these foundational truths have you seen to be ground zero? How many of these foundational truths have you seen under attack in our culture? Because if you're going to want to topple something, what are you going to aim at? You're going to aim at the foundation. That's why these foundational truths are so important for you to hold to in your mind, in your understanding, and for you to be able to share with those that are depending on you for the truth. Just coming to conclusion here, we turn our minds to communion. You know, Jesus modeled for us how to deal with the situation when we know what God desires, when we know what God has willed, but yet we know it's difficult. What did he say in the garden? Not my will, but yours be done.